Hi everybody, thank you for joining me as I continue my examination of N.T. Wright's Simply Christian from my atheist perspective. In this video, I'm going to cover chapters 5 and 6 of the book, so let's go ahead and get started right away with chapter 5, which is titled God. Nice specific subject there. Wright opens this chapter by reiterating that the echoes of a voice that he's been discussing in the book so far, and just as a reminder, those echoes are the desires that people have for justice, spirituality, interpersonal relationships, and beauty. Wright reiterates that these echoes of a voice, as he calls them, do not point directly to any specific God, let alone the God of Christianity. Christianity offers itself as the true story about God, the true explanation of where that voice comes from and what it is saying, but we need more than just those echoes of a voice in order to establish Christianity as such. And Wright says, quote, "To change the picture, the reflections we have offered so far are like paths which appear to lead to the center of a maze, and which do indeed bring us near the goal, but then leave us tantalizingly short, separated from the center by a thick hedge. I do not believe that they, or any other paths, lead the unaided human mind all the way from reflective atheism to Christian faith. Still less do they prove either the existence of God or his particular character. It's a deeper problem than that. It has to do with the meaning of the word God itself." Wright challenges the idea that God is an entity within our world that can be studied in the same way we study objects or subjects like music or mathematics. Wright points out that our English word God can be used as both a common noun and a proper noun. It is both the general term for a deity and the name of one specific deity, typically the God that we see described in the Bible. Wright points out that do you believe in a God is a very different question than do you believe in God. And I would say that that is very true. Those are different questions, though I think Christians take greater advantage of that confusion than do non-religious people. Even when discussing religious subjects with people who are open non-believers, many Christians treat the existence of a God as a foregone conclusion, and they approach the subject with the aim of just making sure we've placed our trust in the right God. Do you believe in God, as in do you believe in my God, the God of the Bible, is a much more commonly heard question in my experience than do you believe in a God. Another problem, Wright says, is that many people just haven't got a very good understanding of what Christianity teaches about God. He says, quote, "Sometimes when people are asked whether they believe in God, they picture an image that few sensible people could believe in if they tried for a week. An old man with a long white beard, sitting in a cloud, looking down angrily at the mess we humans are making of the world. That imagery has only a loose relationship to any serious Christian reflection, yet it's remarkable how many people think that that is what we Christians are talking about when we say the word God. It's also remarkable how many Christians seem to be talking about exactly that sort of thing when they say the word God. Wright may be aiming over the heads of a certain segment of his audience here. Certainly, I'm not saying that all Christians have such a crude, cartoonish view of God, but many Christians, including many known to me personally, seem to have exactly that view of God. He is literally their Father, not necessarily literally in the sky, but literally in heaven. He's, as Wright derisively describes him. So, Wright says God isn't an object within our universe, and therefore he is not subject to inspection in the same way other objects are. But according to Christianity, there was one point where God was an object in our universe, and that was when he was incarnated as Jesus. But Wright wants to save questions about Jesus for a later chapter. For now, his general point is that God doesn't live in our universe, and no matter how hard we look for him, we'll never be able to find him on our own. The question then becomes, if God isn't here or up in the sky, as Wright says, then where is he? Well, my answer would be that he's in the same place as Zeus and Ahura Mazda and Vishnu and Odin and Osiris and every other god you could name. He isn't actually anywhere other than in our imaginations. Now, as you might expect, this is not Wright's answer to that question. Wright addresses the traditional Christian belief derived from the Bible that God is in heaven. There are two common misunderstandings that Wright wants to correct when discussing this belief. First, even though, like the word God, the word heaven can refer both to the place where God lives and to the sky, as in the heavens, heaven in the Christian sense should not be understood as a location within our universe. No matter how far you travel, in whatever direction, you will never come to the place where God lives. God's space is separate from our space. And Wright says, quote, "The question is then whether God's space and our space intersect, and if so, how, when, and where." And how we know, I would add. That's very, very important. If we have an opinion on where and when God's space intersects with our own, how do we know that? The second misunderstanding has to do with where the souls of the dead go when they die. The word heaven is also commonly used to refer to this place, which Wright finds a bit misleading, since to speak of heaven as a final destination for God's people suggests that it was set up for our benefit, when, in fact, according to Wright, it's been there all along. It is simply the place where God is and always has been. The best way of thinking about it is to draw a line between heaven, which is God's space, and earth, which is our space, the universe in which we live, earth being used as just sort of a general term. That's it. Those are the two places that Wright is defining, and they are separate spaces. And again, the question is, how do these two separate spaces interact with one another? And again, I would ask, if they do, how do we know? Wright describes three basic ways in which God's space and our space might interact, or different ideologies or worldviews that have tried to illustrate or explain or understand how God's realm and our realm might intersect and interact. Option one is what Wright describes as pantheism. That is, that God's space and our space are the same thing, and that God is everywhere and everything, and everywhere and everything is God. That we are basically surrounded by and permeated by this force of divinity, which is God. And our main goal as people should then be to recognize and to get in touch with that divinity and to commune with it and tune ourselves to it and come to understand it. A variation of pantheism is Panentheism, which holds that everything that exists is a part of God, or sort of contained within God, but not everything is God. Not everything is touched by that force of divinity. And this slight adjustment from traditional pantheism relieves people of the obligation of regarding everything, including things that we would consider negative from our perspective, like cancer cells or natural disasters, as divine. Wright says, quote, "The problem with pantheism, and to a large extent with panentheism, is that it can't cope with evil. When everything, including yourself, shares in or lives within divinity, there's no higher court of appeal when something bad happens. Nobody can come and rescue you. The world and the divine are what they are, and you'd better get used to it." You know, I find it very telling that Wright's problem with pantheism isn't that he has no evidence compelling him to believe that it's true, but that he is troubled by the implications of that worldview. Many of those same implications can be inferred from atheism. There's no higher court of appeal, there's no help from above, we're on our own here, sometimes bad things just happen and there's nothing we can do about it. Apparently, The fact that N.T. Wright wouldn't like having to live in such a universe is enough for him to decide that it can't possibly be true. Wright also worries that a pantheistic view of the world with no God in authority to impose justice and meaning on an often tragic and chaotic world drives many people to despair and suicide. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later. Option 2 of the 3 options is deism, where heaven and earth are completely separate and God doesn't involve himself in the affairs of our world at all. They're two totally separate independent spheres. Wright specifically references Epicurus and Lucretius, who proposed that in such a world, a deistic world where the gods don't intervene ever, either to help or to harm, the best thing to do was just to live the best, most enjoyable life that you could. As with his interpretation of pantheism, Wright is troubled that this view of the world could lead people to despair. People fortunate enough to live lives of wealth and ease would probably be fine, believing that they lived in such a world, but the vast majority of people who are born into lower, harsher circumstances might well decide that since their lives were miserable and there was nothing they could do about it, the best option was death. But that's not Wright's only problem with the belief in distant, impersonal gods. He has another problem. Quote, "The real problem with Epicureanism in the ancient world and deism in ours is that it has to plug its ears to all those echoing voices we were talking about earlier in this book." It doesn't have to plug its ears to those voices. It just has to look for a source other than a personal God who is trying to tell us something. Wright himself has admitted in previous chapters of this book that those distant echoes, as he calls them, might be our own voices reflecting back at us. Now that's obviously not what Wright thinks that they actually are, but he has admitted to that possibility. Now, as with his rejection of pantheism, he is rejecting that possibility simply because he doesn't like it. But you being personally troubled by the implications of a proposition doesn't render the proposition false. A true statement is true no matter how we feel about it. I expect that N.T. Wright would agree with that statement. But when it comes to why we should favor his unsubstantiated superstition over someone else's, he seems to forget about that. Before we move on to option 3, I also want to say something briefly about this idea that pantheism and deism can lead people in difficult circumstances to despair and to suicide. I find this incredibly condescending, this idea that people need to have this belief in something greater. They need to believe that there is a God who loves them, who will magically set the world right, or else they will be unable to find any reason to go on. I'm sure that there are some people who would take that belief. There are some people who live in awful, dire circumstances, who cling to superstition and religion as a source of hope. But to assume that the vast majority of people, if it were established that we live in such a universe, would just give in to despair and fling themselves off a cliff, I find incredibly condescending. Option 3 is that we live in a theistic universe. It's the theism of Judaism and Christianity, that heaven and earth are neither coexistent in the same space nor entirely separate. They are independent, distinct places, but they interlock and they overlap. Wright illustrates this by referring to the Old Testament, which teaches that God's realm is heaven and our realm is earth, but also tells of God making his presence felt to people living in the earth realm on multiple occasions. Wright says that this third option is better able to handle the difficulties that are left unaddressed by the first 2 options. For example, when we come to the question of creation, the theism of Judaism and Christianity allows not only for the creation of this world, but it also allows for God's action within it. Why did God make the world? Why does God act within this world? Why does he care what happens? Christianity and Judaism, according to Wright, explain this much better than deism or pantheism. And that's because, according to the Judeo-Christian model, the world was made as an outpouring of God's love. God is love, love wants to give, and part of God's giving was to create this world. And since it's a creation of Him and an act of His love, He has remained close to it, even after He created it. So in this way, creation was neither accidental nor, depending on how you define the term, supernatural, because it was the product of a loving Creator. Part of God's ongoing loving involvement with this world He created is His concern with the corruption and rebellion of the creation, ourselves included. Wright says, quote, "This is something the pantheist can't cope with, as we saw. Even Panentheism has a hard time giving a serious account of the radical nature of evil, let alone what a good God might do about it. As for the deist God, there is simply a shrug of the shoulders. If the world is in a mess, why should God care? Hadn't we better try to sort things out by ourselves?" Once again, Wright is blatantly appealing to consequences in order to make his case. You should believe in Christianity rather than in pantheism or deism, as Wright is describing them, because Christianity is more reassuring. Because Christianity has a personal God who made the world out of love and who cares about you and hears your prayers and feels your pain and who is going to do something about the evil we experience in our lives. In Christianity, we are not alone. We're not on our own. And the God who made us and who made everything has promised us that one day there will come a time when all things wrong will be made right. And the only reason Wright offers that we should believe this is true is that we should want it to be true. And that's just not enough for me. Even if I did want it to be true as much as Wright seems to think that I should, it wouldn't be enough for me. The fact that Wright considers Christianity to be the most attractive of the three options he has described does not make it true. Wright concludes the chapter with an examination of the name of God and how it has been regarded by Jews and Christians through the centuries. Ancient Israelites considered the name of their God to be so holy that by the time of Jesus, and perhaps for a long time before that, Jews were not allowed to speak the name of God out loud. And today, Orthodox Jews still refuse to speak or to write the name of God, which we commonly pronounce in English as Yahweh. That name, Yahweh, translates to something like, "I am who I am," which means that this God, the Jewish God, the Christian God as well, cannot be defined with reference to anything else. He simply is what He is, not one being in a category of similar beings, and not something that is found to be present in all things. He simply is Himself, and that's it. Wright says, quote, "He is His own category, and not part of a larger one. That is why we can't expect to mount a ladder of arguments from our world and end up in His, any more than we might expect to mount a ladder of moral achievement and end up making ourselves good enough to stand in His presence." The fact that your God has been defined in such a way as to place Him beyond human science and philosophy is not a reason to believe that He exists. That's just a bit of philosophical, rhetorical cleverness to try and rationalize and escape and distract from the fact that there's no evidence for Him. When Wright explains that we can't understand God the way we understand other phenomena because He is simply beyond our understanding, he sounds to me suspiciously like Carl Sagan describing the invisible, undetectable dragon living in his garage. The key difference is that Sagan meant to illustrate why claims of that sort shouldn't be taken seriously, and Wright is completely in earnest. He expects us and wants us to take this seriously as an explanation for why we can't pigeonhole God, why we can't scientifically know and understand God. Wright describes how the reluctance to speak God's proper name led to the use of placeholder terms like the Lord, and how then that term, the Lord or Lord, eventually became confused in much the same way as the words God and heaven have been. Over the centuries, the Lord has been used to refer specifically to Yahweh, specifically to Jesus, and then also now to a more generic deity that may or may not be thought of as connected to Jesus or to Judaism or Christianity. The best way to make sense of this confusion, Wright says, is to examine the people who believed themselves to be the chosen people of Yahweh, the one true God. By understanding them, by understanding their story, we can better understand Jesus. And when we understand Jesus, we will better understand the source of those distant echoes that Wright has been going on about since the first chapter of the book. So let's move on right away to chapter 6, which is titled Israel. So, about those chosen people. Why write an entire chapter about Israel, Wright asks at the beginning of this chapter? Because the life of Jesus can't be properly understood in any other context. Jesus' life and death and resurrection were the culmination of the story of Israel. Before he gets into that story, Wright acknowledges that there are some difficulties that modern Christians have when it comes to discussing Israel, to discussing the Jews. First, modern Jews exist inescapably in the shadow of the Holocaust, which took place within Christian Europe, which had a long and ugly history of anti-Semitism long before the crimes of Hitler were committed. Second, there is the problem of historicity, just the basic question of how much can we know about the history of Israel, about the story of the Hebrews that we find in the Bible. How can we really know that Abraham and Moses and David and other figures depicted in the Old Testament really existed and really experienced the events that are described in the Bible? Wright sidesteps the questions of historicity and, to his credit, admits that he is doing such by telling the story of Israel the way a Jew in the time of Jesus would have understood it. Rather than wrestle with the historical uncertainties, Wright will simply present the story as it would have been understood in Jesus' day in order to establish the religious context in which Jesus lived and in which his life would have been understood, according to Wright, by early Christians. Well, that's all well and good, but telling the story as first century Jews would have understood it, or rather perhaps as first century Christians would have understood it if we bring the life of Jesus into the mix, doesn't render the historical questions irrelevant. If we're supposed to understand Jesus as the climax of the story of Israel, doesn't it matter whether or not significant portions of that story actually happened? If Adam and Eve and Noah and Abraham and Moses, etc., weren't real people, and the events that are depicted in their lives in the Old Testament never actually happened, then what exactly is Jesus supposed to have fulfilled or culminated or whatever in his life, death, and resurrection? At a certain point, the historical questions become unavoidable. Wright begins his examination of the story of Israel by looking at Abraham, through whose descendants God promised to bless all the people of the earth. God makes a covenant with Abraham, and Wright is careful to define that it is a covenant, not a contract, because a contract would imply an equality between the two parties, and God is clearly the dominant party in his agreement with Abraham. And Wright is completely fine with this. He just wants to make sure that we realize that God is the dominant party in the covenant. And the covenant represents God's commitment to look after Abraham, to be his God, and to use Abraham and his family, his descendants, to bless the whole world. Now, of course, almost from the beginning, Abraham and his people have trouble holding up their end of the bargain. They are not merely the solution, they become part of the problem. They try, they fall short, they try again. This, Wright says, is the theme that is at the heart of the story of Israel. It is the theme of going away and coming back. There is slavery and there is exodus. There is exile and there is restoration. And finally, for Christians at least, there is Jesus, the ultimate expression and culmination of this theme with his death and his return to life. Wright attributes the prominence of the going away and coming back theme to the fact that a large part of the Hebrew scriptures were probably finalized during the Babylonian exile period, when the Jews found themselves once again in one of those going away phases, hoping and waiting for their eventual comeback to their homeland. As it turned out, even the end of the Babylonian exile was not the end of the troubles for Israel. They found that their homeland was ruled by larger empires, a succession of larger empires: the Persians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Syrians, and ultimately the Romans. And so they came to view their exile in a deeper, less literal sense. Even though they had returned to their homeland, they still felt like they were in exile, or that they were oppressed, or that they were held back in some way. They were waiting for that comeback. This led to the belief in a future time when God would ultimately fulfill his promises for good, when Israel would finally be free from all oppression, when all those who had oppressed and enslaved them would be defeated and would be judged by a new kind of king of Israel, a Messiah, who would have the power and the wisdom to finally put the world right. This idea came about that it wouldn't be just another restoration, but it would be a final, permanent restoration. The entire world would be put right for the benefit, potentially, of all people, not just the people of Israel. The original exile, Wright says, was the exile of man from the Garden of Eden, and that is the exile, according to the Christian worldview and the Jewish worldview as well. That is the exile that we are all still living in right now. We are still in the exile period after the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, after the fall of man. So the repeated going away and coming back that we find in the stories of the Old Testament are merely reenactments of this original and ultimate expulsion that people experienced. And the final coming back, the final restoration, will be when the Messiah comes and establishes a new earth, a restored Eden, that will fulfill God's promises to Abraham to use him to bless all the world, because the vessel carrying that blessing is Jesus. In this lengthy retelling of the story of Israel, which takes up the majority of this chapter, Wright references the suffering servant passage of the book of Isaiah. And to Wright's credit, he doesn't treat this passage as a messianic prophecy, or at least he doesn't treat it as only that. It's very common for modern Christian apologists to cite the suffering servant passage as a clear prophecy of the coming of Jesus. And many, in fact, outright declare that Jesus is the suffering servant, that Isaiah was literally writing about Jesus when he wrote about the suffering servant. Wright, in his analysis, notes that there are parallels between the servant and the life of Jesus as we find it in the Gospels, but he also points out that the plight of the servant parallels that of Israel itself, which is the most common Jewish interpretation of that passage. In previous An Atheist Read series, I've mentioned that as well, that the common Jewish interpretation of the suffering servant passages of Isaiah are that the servant represents Israel. It has nothing to do with the Messiah, certainly has nothing to do with the specific character of Jesus, who nobody writing Isaiah would have had any idea about. It was many, 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 many years before the time of Jesus that the suffering servant is Israel. So Wright at least acknowledges that and doesn't treat the passage as a literal, unequivocal, inarguable messianic prophecy. Wright concludes this chapter by summing up the story of Israel in its broadest thematic terms. It's a story of creation and of redemption, of a faithful God acting within his chosen people to bring justice and peace and restoration to a broken world. Wright says, quote, "It's a wonderful dream, rich, multi-layered, full of pathos and power. But why should anyone suppose that it, or anything else that might be built upon it, is anything more than a dream? Why should we imagine it's true? The whole New Testament is written to answer that question, and the answers all focus, of course, on Jesus of Nazareth." Is that Wright's way of admitting that we have no evidence for the truth of the Old Testament, and that we have to accept that it's true because Jesus accepted that it was true, and he was the Son of God, so it's not like he could have been wrong? If so, it's nice to see that Wright hasn't abandoned the historical questions about the Old Testament. He's merely slid them over into the same pile as the historical questions about the New Testament. Now for these upcoming chapters that I'm about to cover in the next few episodes of this series, I'm curious to see what evidence N.T. Wright has to compel us to accept the New Testament as an authoritative historical source, not only for the events it depicts, but also for the Old Testament. Though if the shameless appealing to consequences and wishful thinking of chapter 5 are any indication, I shouldn't expect that evidence to be very impressive. The story that sounds the best to you is not necessarily the true one. In fact, it may be that none of the stories you are considering are true. In chapter 5, when Wright was discussing his 3 options for understanding how heaven and earth relate to one another, he left out a 4th option, that there is no heaven. We might be disappointed to find that we live in such a world. We might wish to live in a world with God and heaven and a dragon in Carl Sagan's garage. But our wishing for it doesn't make it so, nor is our wishing for it evidence that it is so, or even that it might be so. If you're willing to believe in something without evidence, you're willing to believe in anything. If you care at all about what is true, if you care at all about whether or not the things you believe are actually true, you cannot allow yourself that indulgence. You have to ask honest questions and search for the right answers. And when you find those answers, you have to be brave enough to accept them, whether you like them or not. Well, that's the end of these 2 chapters. That's the end of this video. I'll be back in the next edition of this series to cover the next 2 chapters of Simply Christian. Those would be chapter 7, Jesus and the Coming of God's Kingdom, and chapter 8, Jesus, Rescue and Renewal. That last one sounds like a Lifetime movie about Jesus, doesn't it? Jesus, Rescue and Renewal. Tonight on the Lifetime Movie Network. I don't know, maybe. That's it for this episode. I will be back in the next episode to cover those 2 chapters. Thank you guys so much for watching this. I'm continually thrilled and pleased beyond words that this is of use to you and of interest to you. As always, feel free to leave a comment on this video. Challenge me, agree with me, disagree with me, tell me I'm right, tell me I'm wrong, tell me I'm, a genius, tell me I'm an idiot. I'm interested to hear what you have to say and have a conversation with you no matter what, whether you're an atheist or a theist or whatever. So thank you again for watching, and I'll see you next time.